The rain fell heavily on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace that cold December morning. Officer James Thompson stood motionless at his post, his red uniform soaked through but his discipline unwavering. He had been a Queen's Guard for 8 years, trained to remain still no matter what happened around him. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. A small crowd had gathered despite the terrible weather. Most tourists stayed away on days like this, but a few dedicated visitors still came to see the famous guards who never moved, never spoke, never showed emotion. James had grown used to the cameras, the jokes, the attempts to make him smile or flinch. He was a statue in a red coat, or so everyone believed. Then he saw her, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with golden curls peeking out from under a bright yellow raincoat. She was holding her mother's hand tightly, but her eyes were fixed on James with a curiosity that made his heart skip a beat. The child reminded him so much of his own daughter, Emma, who was the same age and had the same bright, wondering eyes. The little girl whispered something to her mother, who smiled sadly and shook her head. But the child was persistent. She tugged on her mother's coat and pointed at James, then at something in her small backpack. James couldn't hear their conversation over the rain, but he could see the mother's reluctance slowly giving way to her daughter's determination. Finally, the mother nodded, and the little girl broke away from her grip. She walked slowly toward James, her small boots splashing in the puddles. When she was just a few feet away, she stopped and looked up at him with those innocent eyes that seemed to see right through his stoic facade. Mommy says you can't talk or move," she said in a sweet voice that barely carried over the sound of the rain. "But I wanted to give you something anyway." James felt his throat tighten. He wasn't supposed to respond, wasn't supposed to acknowledge her at all. But this child, this precious little soul, was offering him something with such pure kindness that it took every ounce of his training to remain still. The girl reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, hand-drawn picture. It was clearly the work of a child, with stick figures and bright crayon colors that had smudged slightly in the rain. She held it up so James could see it clearly. The drawing showed a tall figure in a red uniform standing next to a small girl with yellow hair. Above them, she had written in shaky letters, "Thank you for keeping us safe." Tears began to well up in James's eyes, but he blinked them back quickly. He couldn't let them fall, couldn't let anyone see how deeply this simple gesture had affected him. The little girl carefully placed the drawing at his feet, making sure it wouldn't blow away in the wind. "I know you have to stand here all day," she continued, her voice growing softer as she spoke. "My daddy was a soldier too before he went to heaven. Mommy says soldiers like you watch over everyone even when it's hard." James felt his composure beginning to crack. This wasn't just any child making an innocent gesture. This was a little girl who understood sacrifice, who had already lost her father to service and duty. She was honoring that sacrifice by reaching out to another person in uniform, another guardian who stood watch regardless of the cost. The mother approached slowly, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. She placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder and whispered, "Come on, sweetheart. We should let the nice guard do his job." But as they turned to leave, the little girl looked back one more time. "I hope you get to go home to your family soon," she said simply, then skipped away with her mother, her yellow raincoat a bright spot of color disappearing into the gray morning. James stood there for the remaining 4 hours of his shift, the little girl's drawing at his feet, her words echoing in his mind. Every time a tourist tried to distract him or make him break character, he thought about her understanding eyes and her father who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Every time the rain grew harder and his feet began to ache, he remembered her simple wish that he would get to go home to his family. When his replacement finally arrived, James carefully picked up the drawing and tucked it safely inside his uniform. As he walked back to the guardhouse, he pulled out his phone and sent a text to his wife. "Hug Emma extra tight today. Tell her Daddy loves her and will be home soon." That night, James sat at his kitchen table with his daughter on his lap, showing her the picture the little girl had drawn. Emma traced the crayon lines with her finger and asked, "Did she really give this to you while you were working, Daddy?" "Yes, she did," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And it reminded me why what we do matters." The drawing now hangs in a frame in James's study, a reminder that even when they seem like statues, the royal guards are human beings with families, feelings, and hearts that can be touched by the simple kindness of a child who understood more about duty and sacrifice than most adults ever would. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, jolting Sergeant Michael Davies from a deep sleep. As a senior member of the Queen's Guard, he was used to unexpected calls, but something in the commanding officer's voice told him this was different. His wife stirred beside him as he fumbled for the bedside lamp. "Davies, I need you at the hospital immediately," came the gruff voice through the phone. "It's about young Parker. There's been an accident." Michael's blood ran cold. Private Tommy Parker was barely 22, fresh-faced and eager, reminding Michael of himself when he first joined the Guard 15 years ago. Tommy had been like a younger brother to all the senior guards, always ready with a joke to lighten the mood during long shifts, always the first to volunteer for extra duty. Within 20 minutes, Michael was dressed and driving through the empty London streets toward the hospital. His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Tommy had been on leave visiting his girlfriend in Brighton. What could have happened? The sterile hospital corridors felt endless as Michael made his way to the intensive care unit. He found the commanding officer, Colonel Harris, standing outside a room with several other guards. Their faces told the story before anyone spoke a word. "Car accident," Colonel Harris said quietly. "Tommy was driving back from Brighton last night. A drunk driver ran a red light." He paused, his usually stern expression softening. "He's alive, but barely. The doctors aren't sure if he'll make it through the night." Through the window, Michael could see Tommy lying motionless in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped steadily, keeping track of his fight for life. His face was bruised and swollen, barely recognizable as the cheerful young man who had been cracking jokes in the guardhouse just 2 days ago. "His parents are on their way from Scotland," the colonel continued. "They won't be here for several hours. I thought he should have some familiar faces around him." Michael nodded, understanding immediately. The Queen's Guard wasn't just a job, it was a brotherhood. When one of them was in trouble, the others rallied around him no matter what. As the night wore on, more guards arrived. They took turns sitting with Tommy, talking to him even though he couldn't respond, sharing memories and stories as if their voices alone could pull him back from the brink. Michael found himself holding Tommy's hand, something he never would have imagined doing in any other circumstances. "Remember last month when you tried to make that tourist laugh by winking at her?" Michael whispered. "She was so shocked she dropped her camera. You felt terrible about it for weeks." The machines continued their steady rhythm, the only sound in the quiet room besides the occasional shuffle of feet as guards changed places. Each man dealt with the vigil in his own way. Some stood at attention, as if their discipline could somehow protect their friend. Others sat slumped in chairs, the weight of helplessness visible in their posture. Around dawn, Tommy's parents arrived. His mother, a small woman with kind eyes, broke down when she saw her son. His father, a retired police officer, stood stoic and silent, but Michael could see the man's hands shaking as he reached out to touch his boy's forehead. "You're his friends from work?" Tommy's mother asked through her tears. The guards nodded. "He talks about you all in his letters. Says you're like family to him." "He is family to us," Michael replied, and he meant every word. The next few days blurred together. Guards rotated their regular duties to maintain a constant presence at the hospital. They brought Tommy's parents meals, offered shoulders to cry on, and maintained their vigil by his bedside. The nurses commented that they had never seen anything like it. This group of men who were famous for showing no emotion, now openly displaying their love and concern for their brother in arms. On the 4th day, as Michael was reading a newspaper aloud to Tommy's unconscious form, he felt a slight squeeze on his hand. At first he thought he had imagined it, but then it happened again, stronger this time. "Tommy," Michael whispered, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" Tommy's eyelids fluttered, and slowly, painfully, they opened. His eyes were unfocused at first, but gradually they found Michael's face. A weak smile crossed Tommy's lips. "Sarge," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Did I miss morning parade?" Michael laughed through his tears, the sound echoing through the room as other guards rushed over. "You missed a lot more than that, you idiot. But don't worry, we've been holding down the fort." Tommy's recovery was slow but steady. The guards continued their support, visiting him during his rehabilitation, helping him with physical therapy exercises, and keeping his spirits up with their constant banter. They had seen their brother at his most vulnerable, and in doing so they had revealed their own vulnerability. Months later, when Tommy finally returned to duty, he was different. The experience had matured him, given him a deeper appreciation for life and for the bonds between the men he served with. But he wasn't the only one who had changed. The entire unit had been transformed by those days in the hospital. They still maintained their stoic professionalism during public duties, but among themselves they were more open, more willing to support each other through difficult times. They had learned that being strong didn't mean hiding their emotions, but rather having the courage to show them when it mattered most. Michael still thinks about those nights in the hospital whenever he sees Tommy on duty, standing tall and proud in his red uniform. The young man's recovery had been a miracle, but the real miracle had been watching a group of soldiers discover that their greatest strength lay not in their ability to remain unmoved, but in their willingness to be moved by love for their brothers in arms. Guard William Foster had always prided himself on his ability to remain completely still during his duties at Windsor Castle. At 28, he had mastered the art of becoming a living statue, immune to the constant stream of tourists trying to get a reaction from him. But on this particular autumn afternoon, his composure would be tested in a way he never expected. An elderly woman approached his post slowly, using a walking stick to support her frail frame. She was elegantly dressed despite her obvious age, with silver hair neatly pinned back and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. Unlike most visitors who took quick photos and moved on, she stood quietly in front of William, studying him with genuine interest. "You remind me of someone," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight tremor of age. "A young man I knew many years ago." William kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, but he could feel her gaze on him, patient and understanding. Most people grew bored when guards didn't react, but this woman seemed content to simply stand there, lost in her memories. "His name was Edward," she continued, speaking as if to herself. "He was a guard here too back in 1943. We were engaged to be married." Something in her voice, a deep sadness mixed with enduring love, made William's heart clench. He had heard many stories during his time on duty, but there was something different about this woman, something that demanded his attention even though he couldn't show it. "I was 19 then," she went on, her weathered hand tightening on her walking stick. "The war was raging and Edward was so proud to be protecting the royal family. He said he was guarding not just the castle but the future of England itself." The woman paused and William could hear her take a shaky breath. Around them other tourists moved past, snapping photos and chattering, but she remained focused on him, as if he were the only person in the world who could hear her story. "We had planned to marry when his service ended," she said, her voice growing softer. "I had my dress picked out, a lovely white silk my mother had saved for years. Edward had even found a little cottage outside of town where we planned to live. He would joke that after spending so many hours standing perfectly still, he looked forward to a life filled with movement and laughter." William felt a tear threatening to form in his eye. He knew where this story was going, could feel the tragedy approaching like a storm cloud. But in October of 1943, there was an air raid. The woman continued, her voice now barely above a whisper. "Edward and 3 other guards were killed when a bomb hit their shelter. He was 24 years old." The tear that had been building finally broke free, rolling slowly down William's cheek. He couldn't wipe it away, couldn't acknowledge it, could only let it fall as this brave woman shared her heartbreak with him. "I've come here every year since then," she said, noticing the tear but showing no surprise at his emotional response. 67 years I've been visiting, watching young men like Edward stand guard, protecting what he died for. Most people don't understand what it means to serve like this, to put duty above everything else." More tears followed the first, and William realized that other tourists were starting to notice. Some pointed and whispered, amazed to see a guard showing emotion. But he didn't care. This woman's story, her decades of faithful remembrance, deserved his tears. "I never married," she said simply. "I couldn't. Edward was my one true love, and losing him, well, some wounds never heal, do they? But I've lived a good life, teaching children for 40 years, traveling the world, making friends. Edward would have wanted that for me." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small faded photograph. Even from his peripheral vision, William could see it showed a young couple clearly in love, standing outside the very castle where he now stood guard. "This was our last photo together," she said, holding it up so he could see it clearly. He was so handsome in his uniform, so proud of his service. "You look quite a lot like him, you know. Same strong jaw, same serious eyes." The photograph showed a young man who could have been William's brother, standing next to a beautiful young woman with sparkling eyes and a radiant smile. The love between them was so obvious it seemed to leap from the faded paper. "I'm 96 years old now," the woman said, carefully returning the photo to her purse. "The doctors tell me this will likely be my last visit here. My heart isn't what it used to be, and the journey from my home in Yorkshire grows harder each year." William wanted desperately to speak to her, to tell her how moved he was by her story, how honored he felt to have heard it. But duty held him silent, though his tears continued to flow freely. "I want you to know," she said, stepping closer, "that every year when I come here I feel Edward's presence. In the dedication of guards like you, in the pride you take in protecting what matters. He would have been so proud to know that young men still stand where he once stood, still honor the same oath he took." She stood there for a few more minutes, seemingly drawing strength from William's silent presence. Other tourists had gathered, some taking photos of the crying guard, others simply watching respectfully as they sensed something important was happening. "Thank you," the woman finally said, her voice strong despite her tears. "Thank you for letting an old woman share her memories, for showing that beneath that uniform beats the heart of a man who understands love and loss and sacrifice." As she turned to walk away, William did something he had never done in 6 years of service. He moved. Just slightly, just enough to nod his head in acknowledgement of her story, of her faithfulness, of her love that had endured for nearly 7 decades. The woman saw the nod and smiled through her tears. She nodded back, a gesture of understanding between two people whose lives had been touched by duty and loss. Then she walked slowly away, her walking stick tapping against the stone pathway. William resumed his position, but he was forever changed. That evening he called his girlfriend Sarah and told her he loved her, really loved her in a way he had never expressed before. The elderly woman's story had shown him that love was precious and fragile, and that expressing it shouldn't be delayed until it was too late. 3 weeks later, William received a letter at the castle. It was from the woman's niece informing him that Margaret Harrison had passed away peacefully in her sleep, with Edward's photograph clutched in her hands. The niece had found William's name and unit information in her aunt's diary, where she had written about her final visit to Windsor Castle and the kind guard who had cried with her. William attended Margaret's funeral on his day off, standing at attention as she was laid to rest beside an empty grave marked with Edward's name. As the service ended, he placed a single red rose on each grave, honoring a love that had transcended death and a woman whose faithfulness had taught him about the deeper meaning of service. The protest began quietly enough on that gray March morning outside Buckingham Palace. Guard Captain Robert Hayes had seen demonstrations before during his 12 years of service, but this one felt different. The crowd was smaller than usual, maybe 50 people, but their signs carried messages that cut straight to his heart. Support our veterans, mental health matters, and no soldier left behind. Robert stood at his post near the main gate, watching as the protesters arranged themselves peacefully along the fence. Among them, he recognized several faces that made his throat tighten with recognition. These weren't ordinary protesters. These were family members of soldiers who had served and suffered, many of them carrying photos of their loved ones who had struggled with the invisible wounds of war. One woman in particular caught his attention. She was middle-aged with graying brown hair and eyes that held the weight of unbearable loss. She carried a large photograph of a young soldier in dress uniform, his smile bright and hopeful. Robert could see the family resemblance immediately, the same strong cheekbones and gentle eyes. As the morning progressed, the woman moved closer to Robert's position. She didn't shout or wave her sign aggressively like some protesters did. Instead, she stood quietly, holding her son's photograph against her chest as if she were hugging him. "His name was David," she said suddenly, her voice directed at Robert even though she knew he couldn't respond. "Corporal David Mitchell. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan, came home with medals and nightmares." Robert felt his heart beginning to race. He had served in Afghanistan himself, had seen the toll that combat took on young soldiers. He knew the stories too well, the ones that didn't make it into the official reports about courage and victory. The nightmares started right away. the woman continued, her voice steady but filled with pain. David couldn't sleep, couldn't be in crowds, couldn't handle loud noises. He tried to get help, but the waiting lists were so long and the system failed him. Around them, other protesters were chanting softly, calling for better support for veterans' mental health. But Robert found himself focused entirely on this woman and her story, feeling each word like a physical blow. He tried to hold on, she said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. He got a job, tried to build a normal life. But the demons were too strong. Last Christmas morning, I found him in his room. He couldn't fight anymore. Robert felt his own eyes filling with tears. He had lost friends to suicide after their service ended, had struggled with his own dark moments when the memories became too heavy to bear. This woman's story could have been about any of them. I'm not here to blame anyone, she continued, looking directly into Robert's eyes. I'm here because I know there are other soldiers like my David, still fighting battles that nobody can see. I want them to know they're not alone, that their service mattered, that they matter. The tears were flowing freely down Robert's face now, but he couldn't move to wipe them away. He stood at attention while his heart broke for this mother who had lost her son to a war that followed him home. I know you're not supposed to react, the woman said softly, but I can see in your eyes that you understand. You've been where David was, haven't you? You know what it's like to come home from war but never really leave it behind. More protesters had noticed Robert's tears, and a hush fell over the crowd. They seemed to sense that something important was happening, that this was more than just another attempt to get a reaction from a stoic guard. David always respected soldiers like you, the woman said, holding up his photograph so Robert could see it clearly. He said the Royal Guards represented the best of military tradition, that you carried yourselves with honor even when the world seemed chaotic around you. Robert stared at the photograph, seeing his own younger self and David's hopeful expression. How many soldiers had started their service with that same optimism, only to discover that the real battle began when they came home. After David died, I wanted to give up, the woman admitted, her voice breaking. I didn't want to go on without my boy. But then I realized that he would want me to fight for others like him, to make sure no other mother has to find her child the way I found mine. The crowd around them had grown completely silent now, all attention focused on the grieving mother and the guard whose tears testified to his shared understanding of her pain. Even the tourists who had gathered to watch the protest seemed to sense the sacred nature of the moment. I want you to know, she said, stepping as close to the fence as she could get, that what you do matters. Standing there in your uniform, representing duty and honor and service, it gives hope to people like my David. It reminds them that their sacrifice was part of something bigger than themselves. Robert wanted desperately to speak, to tell this brave woman how sorry he was for her loss, how much her son's service had mattered, how proud she should be of the fight she was now fighting in his memory. But all he could do was stand there and let his tears speak for him. I come here every month, she said, beginning to step back. On the anniversary of the day David took his own life, I bring his picture and I tell his story, not to make people sad, but to make them remember, to make them care about the soldiers who are still fighting battles nobody can see. As she turned to rejoin the other protesters, she looked back one more time at Robert. Thank you, she said simply. Thank you for showing that soldiers are human, that you feel deeply, that you understand what it costs to serve. David would have been honored to know that a guard like you heard his story. The protest continued for another hour, but Robert found himself changed by the encounter. That evening he called his own counselor, a conversation he had been putting off for weeks. He also reached out to 2 fellow guards who he knew were struggling with their own demons from their service overseas. Most importantly, he started volunteering at a local veterans support center, using his off-duty time to mentor young soldiers who were transitioning back to civilian life. He never forgot David Mitchell's story, or the courage of the mother who turned her grief into a mission to save others. Months later, Robert received a letter from the woman, thanking him for the impact their encounter had made. She wrote that several veterans had approached her after seeing news coverage of the protest, telling her that seeing a Royal Guard moved to tears by her story had helped them realize they weren't alone in their struggles. One of those veterans was now getting the help he needed and had found the strength to keep fighting his invisible battle. David's story, shared with a guard who couldn't speak but whose tears said everything, had saved a life. In death, her son had finally found a way to continue serving his brothers in arms. The morning shift at St. James's Palace started like any other for guard Daniel Cooper. At 25, he had been serving for 3 years and thought he had seen everything that tourists could throw at him. But as he took his position at the entrance, he noticed something different about the crowd gathering nearby. There was a news crew setting up their equipment, and a group of people who clearly weren't typical sightseers. They wore matching t-shirts with a photo of a smiling teenage girl, and their faces carried the unmistakable weight of people fighting an important battle. Daniel soon learned what was happening when a reporter began speaking to the camera. "We're here today with the family of 16-year-old Lucy Henderson, who lost her battle with leukemia 6 months ago. Her final wish was to meet one of the Queen's Guards, a dream that sadly never came true. Today her family is here to honor her memory and raise awareness for childhood cancer research." Daniel's heart immediately went out to the family. He could see Lucy's parents in the group, their faces etched with grief but also with determination. Her mother clutched a small stuffed animal, worn from years of being loved, while her father held a donation bucket for the cancer charity they had started in their daughter's name. As the reporter continued the interview, Daniel learned more about Lucy's story. She had been fascinated by the Royal Guard since childhood, collecting pictures and reading everything she could find about their history and traditions. During her long hospital stays, she had dreamed of visiting London to see them in person, but her treatments had kept her too weak to travel. Lucy always said the guards were like real-life superheroes, her mother told the reporter, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She admired their dedication, their strength, their ability to stand firm no matter what happened around them. During her hardest days in the hospital, she would tell me she was going to be brave like a Queen's Guard. Daniel felt his composure beginning to crack as he listened to the story. The idea that this sick child had found strength in what he and his fellow guards represented was both humbling and heartbreaking. The family had organized this gathering not just to remember Lucy, but to raise money for the children's hospital where she had been treated. They wanted to help other families going through the same ordeal, to fund research that might prevent other parents from losing their children to this terrible disease. As the interview continued, Lucy's younger brother, who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, spoke to the camera with a maturity far beyond his years. "Lucy always said she was going to get better so she could come here and thank the guards for being her heroes. Since she can't do that now, I want to do it for her." Daniel felt a tear roll down his cheek as the boy approached his position. The child looked up at him with eyes that mirrored his sister's in the photographs, bright and determined despite the sadness they carried. "My sister Lucy really wanted to meet you," the boy said quietly, so only Daniel could hear. "She used to practice standing still like you do, trying to see how long she could be brave when the treatments hurt. She said if she could be as strong as a Queen's Guard, she could beat anything." More tears followed as Daniel realized the profound impact that his simple act of standing at attention could have on someone's life. This little girl had found courage in his example, had used his dedication as a source of strength during her battle with cancer. "I brought something for you," the boy continued, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small pin in the shape of a golden ribbon, the symbol for childhood cancer awareness. "Lucy made this in art therapy at the hospital. She wanted to give it to a guard someday to say thank you for being brave." Daniel's heart was breaking as he stared down at the simple pin the boy held up toward him. He knew he couldn't take it, couldn't move to accept the gift, but every fiber of his being wanted to reach out and honor this child's memory. The boy seemed to understand Daniel's dilemma. "I know you can't move," he said with wisdom beyond his years. "But Lucy would just want you to know that you helped her be brave. Even though she never got to meet you, you were still her hero." The crowd that had gathered to watch was completely silent now. Even hardened news reporters were wiping away tears as they witnessed this extraordinary moment of connection between a grieving family and a guard who was bound by duty to remain motionless. Lucy's mother approached slowly, carrying the stuffed animal Daniel had noticed earlier. It was a small teddy bear wearing a miniature Red Guard uniform, clearly handmade with loving care. "Lucy made this during one of her stays in the hospital," she said, her voice breaking. She called him Captain Courage and took him everywhere. He helped her get through the scary treatments, the long nights when she couldn't sleep, the days when she felt too sick to smile. She placed the bear carefully at Daniel's feet, where it stood like a tiny sentinel beside the towering guard. She would have wanted him to keep watch with a real guard just once, This seems like the right place for him. Daniel could no longer hold back his emotions. The tears flowed freely as he stared down at the little bear that represented one child's incredible courage in the face of unimaginable challenges. Around him, he could hear other people in the crowd beginning to cry as well, moved by the raw emotion of the moment. The family stayed for another hour, telling stories about Lucy to anyone who would listen, collecting donations for their charity, and keeping her memory alive through their love and determination. Throughout it all, Daniel stood at his post, tears streaming down his face, honored to be part of their tribute to their remarkable daughter. When his shift finally ended, Daniel asked his commanding officer for permission to make a personal donation to Lucy's charity. He also requested information about visiting policies at the local children's hospital, wanting to find a way to continue the inspiration that Lucy had found in his example. That evening, Daniel called his own parents, telling them how much he loved them and how grateful he was for his health and his opportunities. Lucy's story had reminded him that not everyone gets the chance to grow up, to serve their country, to stand tall and strong. The little teddy bear, Captain Courage, was carefully collected and taken to the children's hospital where Lucy had been treated. It now sits in the playroom, wearing its tiny red uniform, continuing to help other sick children find the strength to be brave. And sometimes, when young patients ask about the bear's story, the nurses tell them about the Queen's Guard who cried for a little girl he never met, showing them that real heroes aren't afraid to show their hearts. It was Guard Samuel Wright's final day of service after 15 years as a Queen's Guard. At 38, he was retiring to spend more time with his family and start a new career as a teacher. He had specifically requested to spend his last shift at Buckingham Palace, the place where his journey had begun as a young, eager soldier fresh out of training. As Samuel took his position for the final time, he reflected on the thousands of hours he had spent standing motionless, the countless tourists he had encountered, and the profound moments that had shaped not just his career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to serve with honor and compassion. The morning started quietly, with the usual stream of visitors taking photos and trying unsuccessfully to get reactions from the guards. Samuel found himself more aware than usual of every detail, knowing he would never experience this again. The weight of his rifle, the feel of his uniform, the sounds of London waking up around him, all of it took on a special significance. Around midday, something extraordinary began to happen. A small group of people approached his post, but unlike typical tourists, they seemed to know exactly who he was. An elderly man stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. "Are you Guard Wright?" the man asked. "The one they call the guardian angel of the guards?" Samuel was shocked. He had never heard that nickname before, and he couldn't imagine why anyone would know his name. But as more people gathered, he began to recognize some of the faces, and his heart started to race with understanding. There was Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman whose grandson had autism. Samuel remembered how the boy had a meltdown in front of the palace 2 years ago, screaming and hitting himself while tourists stared and whispered. Samuel had done something unprecedented that day. He had broken protocol slightly, moving just enough to catch the boy's attention, then standing perfectly still while making gentle eye contact until the child calmed down. Mrs. Chen had written to the palace afterward, praising Samuel's compassion. Standing next to her was Marcus, a homeless veteran Samuel had encountered during a winter shift. The man had been sitting in the cold, clearly struggling with mental health issues and addiction. After his duty ended that day, Samuel had bought him a hot meal and helped connect him with veteran services. Marcus now ran a shelter for homeless veterans. There was Jennifer, a young mother whose toddler had wandered away from her in the crowd 2 summers ago. While she panicked, searching frantically, Samuel had used subtle eye movements to guide other guards to the child's location. The little girl was found safe within minutes, and Jennifer had never forgotten the guard whose silent vigilance had saved her daughter. More familiar faces appeared in the growing crowd. There was the school teacher who brought her students to see the guards every year, always making sure to tell them about the day Samuel had maintained his post during a terrorist scare, helping keep everyone calm. There was the photographer who had captured Samuel's tears during the veterans' protest, an image that had helped change public perception of the guards from emotionless statues to caring human beings. Word had somehow spread through social media and local networks that Samuel was retiring. People whose lives he had touched, often without even realizing it, had come to thank him on his final day. The crowd continued to grow throughout the afternoon, each person bringing a story of how this particular guard had made a difference in their lives. An elderly woman approached with a beautiful flower arrangement. "You comforted my daughter during her final visit here," she said, tears in her eyes. "She had terminal cancer, and seeing you stand so strong and steady gave her peace in her last days. She said you were like a guardian angel watching over everyone." A young man in a military uniform stepped forward next. "You helped me when I was considering suicide," he said quietly. "I was standing here 3 years ago, planning to end my life, and something about your dignity and strength made me realize I still had worth. I got help that day, and now I'm serving too, trying to be the kind of soldier you showed me it was possible to be." Samuel's eyes filled with tears as story after story unfolded. He had no idea that his simple acts of human kindness, his moments of breaking slightly from protocol to help someone in need, had created such ripple effects of positive change. A group of children from a local school had made cards and drawings, all showing guards with hearts visible through their uniforms. Their teacher explained that Samuel had once helped calm a student with severe anxiety during a field trip, and ever since then, her class had understood that the guards were real people with real feelings who cared about others. As the afternoon progressed, even other guards began to appear. Colleagues from his 15 years of service came to honor their retiring brother. They shared their own stories of Samuel's kindness, his mentorship of younger guards, his ability to maintain dignity and compassion even in the most challenging situations. Captain Morrison, Samuel's commanding officer, arrived in civilian clothes. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, looking at the crowd that had gathered. "Right, you've shown us all what it really means to serve with honor. You've proven that being a perfect guard isn't about being emotionless, but about having such control over your emotions that you can choose exactly when and how to show them." A local news crew had arrived to document the unprecedented gathering. Samuel watched through his peripheral vision as reporters interviewed people in the crowd, each sharing their personal story of how one guard had changed their life through small acts of kindness and understanding. As evening approached and Samuel's final shift neared its end, the crowd began to sing. It started with one voice, then joined by others, until hundreds of people were singing "God Save the King," in honor of the guard who had served not just the monarchy, but humanity itself with such grace. When Samuel's replacement finally arrived, the retiring guard did something he had never done in 15 years of service. As he stepped down from his post for the final time, he turned to face the crowd that had gathered to honor him. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his bearskin hat and bowed his head in gratitude. The crowd erupted in applause, but it was respectful, reverent applause, the kind reserved for truly moving moments. Samuel looked up at all the faces, so many lives he had touched without realizing it, so many connections made through the simple power of human compassion, expressed even within the constraints of duty. That night, Samuel sat at home with his wife and children, reading through dozens of letters and cards that people had brought throughout the day. His daughter, now 12, looked up at him with new understanding. "Daddy," she said, "I always thought your job was just standing still and looking serious. I didn't know you were helping people." "Sometimes," Samuel replied, pulling her close. "The most important help we give is just being present, being steady, being someone others can count on to care. The uniform might make us look like statues, but underneath, we're just people who want to make the world a little bit better." Samuel's retirement ceremony became a model for how the Queen's Guard could balance tradition with humanity. His story spread far beyond London, inspiring guards and soldiers around the world to understand that true strength includes the courage to show compassion, and that the highest form of service is serving with both discipline and heart. The spot where Samuel had stood for his final shift now bears a small, discreet plaque, in honor of all guards who serve with both strength and compassion. It's a reminder that behind every uniform stands a human being capable of changing lives through simple acts of kindness, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a strong person can do is allow themselves to be moved by the needs of others.